Thank you very much. As Mark said, I'm happy to answer questions about almost as many things as God, but with slightly less omniscience. I'm going to employ two cheap tricks. And the first is to claim that my aim today is to have a conversation. For those of you, I know Peter Barron's here, for those of us who've covered politics, the phrase anybody standing in front of you claiming they want to have a conversation is more or less suicidal, because there is no more vacuous phrase in politics. It's usually an excuse for somebody who has nothing at all to say. There was a moment the other day when Gordon Brown began a speech with that phrase, which made me almost inherently worry about what he was up to. But in this particular time, my aim was to talk for probably about 25 minutes about the idea, this book and the idea of God is back, and then open it up to a conversation, both in terms of if you want to ask about the book, but also if you want to ask about broader things. For as I said, I'm happy to answer about anything other really than technology. I think I'll begin with where the book begins. And the book begins in a sitting room, a little bit smaller than this, about half the size of this room, in Shanghai. It's owned by a man who, for the sake of argument, we'll call Wang, who is a young Chinese man who works for a company which I probably describe as a competitor come partner of Google's, but who we don't identify. In the room gathered, there's a couple of academics, there's a couple of scientists who work on stem cells, there's two CEOs, someone's just flown in from Philadelphia where he was away for the weekend. What we're in is a house church in Shanghai. And this is the center of what I would argue is the most remarkable religious explosion, arguably in some ways since the very beginnings of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Already China, I would argue, has as many as 100 million Christians. There are certainly more people going to church each week in China than there are members of the Communist Party, around 70 million members of the Communist Party. Why is this source of strength, this source of power, why is it cropped up? Because if you go to a house church, what they do is they spend about 2 to 3 hours sitting there, reading one bit of a text and then discussing it. It's admirably high-tech to some extent. It's full of new gadgets. They use computers, they use the internet to download hymns, and they talk repeatedly, mainly led by this guy who, as I said, we'll call Wang. And he goes in very heavy detail through a particular bit. But it's a group of people who are obsessed by this. Why is China suddenly discovering religion in such a big way? Well, I think it's partly, and this is a sort of theme which will crop up repeatedly throughout this talk, it's partly a kind of demand for meaning. You have a country which is going through an enormous change. If you want one statistic about China, I'm going to slightly mess it up. I think in one year, 1997 or 1998, more people moved from the countryside to the cities in China than crossed the Atlantic in the century before 1920. So you have more social dislocation than before. You have a vacuum where there is not much meaning at all, in the sense that the communist ideology has gone, but people want something new to structure their lives around. And this comes through very, very firmly in the house churches. But it's also, I think, a question of supply. It's to do with the fact that the internet is providing ever new ways to reach it. It's to do with the fact that US-style missionaries are rushing around China trying to spur faith forwards. Either Americans or else Koreans particularly are pushing it. It's also, bizarrely, and this I think goes to the apex of our book, which is about religion and politics. It's also a lot to do with government policy, because the interesting thing about that room is, I think in that case there were 26 people in the room, but there is a policy in China, a rule, which says that when any meeting gets to 25 people, beyond that you need government permission. And what the Chinese government have done almost single-handedly, the only previous people I think have done this were actually the Roman emperors, was by setting a limit on how many people can gather together, they have hit the most explosive means of growing religion yet known, because the moment they get to about 24, 25, 26, neighbours begin to complain, people go for the car spaces outside. It's more routine things like that than rather than people actually getting really angry about it, and a house church automatically splits. And so the one I went to within a couple of weeks, has split up into two. One of them was cited went back to the American company where it was, to meets in the American company where Wang works. And each time it splits, it grows, and that is what is pushing it ahead. More generally, I think what's interesting, and the reason why we begin with Wang, is not just because it's fascinating that religion is growing so rapidly in a place which thought it had got rid of it completely, and it's not just Protestantism, but it is mostly that. It's also to do with the fact that this is beginning to impact politics. Because if you talk to the Chinese leadership, they are in a deeply divided position over this amazing phenomenon which is happening within their borders. One part of them is very, I suppose, pleased about the idea that there is a sort of social glue developing. There's something that they can use to bond their country together. They're conscious of the fact that religion is useful to that extent. Indeed, if you look at the official pronouncements, people like Hu Jintao, they've gone from Mao despising, cursing religion, driving people out, killing priests, killing anyone who came towards them, towards an official policy at least of welcoming them, of having established churches, which are still relatively small. There's around 20 million people. The official statistics show in China that around, I think it's 25 million now go to church each week. Those are the people going to the established churches. By any guess, the people going to house churches are 3 or 4 times as big, so it's purely a matter of how much you measure it. But there are official churches. They separate Christians from Catholics, which is an interesting division. But that is the way in which they choose to do it. One half of official China is welcoming religion. The other half is deeply frightened by it. Why? Because in Chinese history, religion, particularly Christian religion, has always been created with difficulty. You had the Taiping Rebellion back in the 19th century. They also, strangely, I think, give the Pope, perhaps, or Pope John Paul II, slightly greater credit than many outsiders would do for his role in bringing down the Soviet Empire. Above all, though, it's the question of a big social organization. Already, as I said, the Chinese church is bigger than the Communist Party. It's also already pretty close to being the largest NGO in the country. These people are beginning to set up schools, they're doing some healthcare, they're already a force within the country. And if the Chinese government was already worried about Falun Gong, the idea of a group of people with such a clear connection to the West is, I think, difficult for them. And so they split between those two feelings. One half of them desperate to kind of cling on to it, to use religion for social purposes, the other bit deeply upset about what it could do. And that is very much what this book is about. This book is about, on the one hand, saying, wake up if you're in Western Europe. Because basically, whether we like it or not, and this is not a book written to either propagate or denounce religion, wake up, because around the rest of the world, religion is doing extremely well. But that brings with it political consequences, both good and bad. If in 10 years' time you read about Chinese Christians helping usher in a new thing of democracy in China, well, that would be good. If, on the other hand, you see very fierce clampdowns and difficulties, well, that is perhaps less persuasive. I should stress that the title of this book is very much a conclusion, not a thesis that we took into it. It's basically, at its core, a work of journalism. It was two people who originally thought about writing a book about religion in America, and then we started from the presumption that America looked something of an exception. But then when you actually look at the numbers, actually the whole question, the whole ideology, which Adrian and I had been brought up, one I suppose one an atheist, the other rather useless Catholic, the ideology in which we'd been brought up in was the idea that religion was bound to disappear. And yet you look around the world and that just isn't true. It's true of Western Europe, it's not true of everywhere else. Indeed, religion on the whole is doing, if anything, rather better. The proportion of people belonging to the main religions has risen from roughly 60% to 70%, even in the conditions when people thought it was going backwards. You look at Asia, you look at Latin America, you look at Africa, and this book essentially is a journalistic foray going around the world and reporting back what exactly we saw. And in fact, it gets more difficult than that for the tradition in which we were brought up in, this idea that whether we liked it or not, religion was bound to go down. There are two other very strange things which are happening around the world. Firstly, the wrong sorts of religion are the ones doing well. In the 60s and 70s, certainly when I was being taught, the general assumption was the only kind of religions which would survive would be the sort of the cleverest sort. There'd be ones where you'd have sort of Graham Greenish doubting Catholicism. You would have very clever Anglicanism, which managed to accommodate to all the new sort of fluxes of society. In fact, on the whole, it tends to be the most emotional ones. You've got Islam to some extent, but you've also got the push of Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism, and Wang was one of them, is the most successful religion of the past century. It started in the back streets of Los Angeles in 1908. There are now as many as 600 million, 700 million charismatics or renewalists around the world. This is the most emotional form of religion. I've been to an exorcism in Brazil, which I'm happy to describe, but it's not necessarily something based around the mind. And to make it even more difficult for those apostles of secularism, the whole idea in which we were brought up in, is the wrong sort of people are flooding towards religion. It's not, as is often depicted, even occasionally on, or used to even occasionally be on organisations like the BBC. If you go to America, the people, mega churches are not being set up in the middle of nowhere, run by useless hicks in the deeper, darker bits of North America. They are in the gleaming suburbs beside malls with Tiffany's and whatever. And it's the same pretty much around the world. The people in Wang's church were not the people who were at the bottom of Chinese society. They were the people struggling to go to the top. If you look at Hindu, if you look at the rise of the BJP in India, you look at the growth of the AK party in Turkey, again you see exactly the sort of prosperous bourgeoisie which the very secular founders of India and Turkey, Ataturk and Nehru, exactly the people they wanted to create who would cast aside all this suspicion. They are exactly the people who are rushing towards religion. So what is going on? And we argue really it's a tale of two revolutions. The first one is the French, and that was a revolution against the Ancien regime, and it was a revolution very much against the church as well. And that European tradition of seeing progress heading in one direction and religion heading in another has been, I think, carried forward by the intellectuals who've dominated this debate ever since. If you think of the tradition I was brought in of Freud, Marx, Darwin, Nietzsche, all these people repeatedly push forward the idea that religion was to move to the side. Now, the interesting thing is that almost exactly the same time as you had the French Revolution, you had the American Revolution, which, whatever it was not remotely against religion. The interesting point about American religiosity, and really what we're saying is it is American religion which is going to be the dominant form, not necessarily, not saying the world is going to go universally Christian or universally evangelical, but the equivalent, if you want, of Google in I can't believe I'm saying this, the equivalent of a leading software company dominating its particular niche is actually American religiosity. That is the one, that is the model which the Chinese are copying. It's the model which is pushing through Latin America. It's the model which is pushing through Africa. And it's the model which I think will probably have some run in Europe. And if you look at where that came from, it didn't really exist before the American Revolution. If you go before the American Revolution, America is basically just as useless as Europe when it comes to revolution. So it comes to religion. There was an established church. Things weren't going particularly well. Even Salem, the place which is used, Arthur Miller used for the crucible, there 83% of households had no religious identification. And the reason why is we always have this vision of America as this place set up by puritanical starters by the founding fathers, not by the founding fathers, by the original kind of Mayflower lot. Well, that's true. The original lot who went there were these kind of die-hard religious fanatics. The people who came straight afterwards were often people who went there, some of them, many of them were sent there against their will. There was a vast amount of young men who would have gone to prison or perhaps even to Australia in later times, but were then sent to America. These were not people who were remotely interested in religion. American religion, all the bishops' letters, there were one or two great awakenings, they called, but by and large, America didn't seem that different to Europe. And why did it change? It changed, I think, because of two documents. If you need to understand why religion can spread, why it does work, you really only need two documents to understand it. The first is the US Constitution, because the US Constitution had that brilliant idea of separating church from state. And what happened in America was before they did that, there wasn't competition. Once they did do that, it changed dramatically. The Methodists, for instance, converted around an eighth of the country within a generation because they were able to get out there. People who were Methodist ministers were not pushed to, they didn't rely on an establishment to keep pushing them up. On this side of the Atlantic, in Britain, the Methodists were always in a bit of difficulty about how they dealt with an established church, whether they were inside the political system, whether they were outside. In America, they were just another faith competing against others. And that brings me to the second document, which I think explains an enormous amount, which is Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. People forget that there is part of that which deals with this. There's a brilliant discussion between Adam Smith, who looked and said, wherever you have an established clergy, you're not going to have religion doing particularly well. And David Hume, who read this and was utterly horrified by this because he loathed religion, very much came from that early tradition. And he begged Smith not to include it because he said once people like the Church of England read this, they'll realise how stupid they are and they'll start having the American system of competing religions. But Smith persevered, not for the last time. And if you look at what's happened in America, you see a relentless succession of waves. You have the Methodists first, but then you have the Baptists. Catholics, actually, within America, competed amazingly successfully because they weren't really an established church. And you see that all the way through to the Pentecostals now. And what you're now seeing around the world is that phenomenon has gone global, like so many other ones. Pentecostalism, as I mentioned, you can go to all sorts of places and see amazing things going on. If you want to look at big mega churches, 5 out of the 10 biggest ones in the world are in Korea. I went to one where there's about 800,000 people are members of one church. It's almost like attending a massive football match several times over on a Sunday. You have legions of ushers taking you to different bits. And it is approached, and one has to be rather crude about saying this, with just as relentless a devotion to marketing and just as relentless devotion to customer segmentation as you'd find in many parts of any other sort of business. There are churches for bikers, there are churches for gays, there are churches for dropouts. There's the Scum of the Earth Church in Colorado. There are Bibles for soldiers, Bibles for teens, Bibles for tweens, Bibles for people in one form of emotional distress, Bibles for the other. There's even Bibles for rappers. Even though I walk through the hood of death, I don't back down, for you have my back, is one selection. You can go to Golgotha Fun Park. And these, as I say, it's not just American and Christian, but that is the dominant, I think, gene in terms of the way in which the religious marketplace around the world is being steered. You can see the same thing in terms of Islamic mega preachers are beginning to pick up some of the same habits that Christian ones do. If you go to Hindu temples in India, you will actually discover a sort of high-tech efficiency of a level, I would argue, which is even greater than you see in the rest of religion. So to some extent, that's the supply side of what's happening. The demand side, I think a lot of it comes from the big economic movement of our time, which remains, I think, globalization. Globalization creates demand for religion in two senses. One is the one which most critics are only too keen to point out, is it creates demand for a storm shelter against change. And I think that is true. I'm not remotely denying that. You go to places, you go to Arkansas, but you can also go to the suburbs of Cairo, and you can find a lot of people who are clinging to religion because they see that as a protection against the onrush of a modern, in some cases, very American world. But at the same time, I think for many, many more people, at least the modern versions of religion, are being seen as a way to get ahead. I don't think it's any accident that the best-selling book about religion in America by miles, but best-selling book of any sort, pretty much in modern times, is a book called The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren. It's about people looking for meaning. It's about people who sit there and think that their life has reached a certain point, but they want some kind of framework to understand it. And the reason why, and again this is looked at from outside objectively, is that man, whether we like it or not, and this is really what we have to confront, particularly people who just assume that religion was going to fade away, is that man is fundamentally a theotropic creature. It's something which man generally will be brought back to. He'll be brought back to religion. And it is also, again, whether we like it or not, a rational thing to do, because religious people, and again, the numbers in America are pretty convincing about this, religious people tend to be healthier, they live longer, they tend to be wealthier, they're better off than other people, and they tend to be wiser, they tend to be better educated. And what's interesting about science at the moment is, whilst you have one group of scientists who are going out producing ever more elaborate evidence as to why God didn't exist at all, for instance, stuff about black holes and so on, you have a whole other bevy of social scientists who are going out looking at the reasons why religion actually seems to work or does quite well. And you have weird experiments where you put nuns and Buddhist monks into MRI machines, not at the same time, to measure what their brains are doing when they listen, when they're praying. You have people looking at the vast number of economists looking at why religious communities seem to work as an organization, and so on and so on. So this, in a sense, is the world in which I think we now have to live in, and understanding that world and suddenly taking into account that there is a different sort of form of reality in most of the world, particularly for people in Western Europe where things are not going that direction, I think is something we have to deal with. Is it a good world? Well, I'd argue to one extent, from the point of view of a liberal editing a liberal paper, it is, albeit a deeply secular one, I would say it is a good one because it's fundamentally based around choice. Modernity, and this I think is the big category mistake. This is a huge mistake which most of the apostles of secularization made. They identified modernity with secularism, and it isn't. Modernity is really about pluralism. It's about the ability to sit there and decide and choose, I'm going to be this, or I'm going to be that, or I'm going to be whatever. And that, I think, is the core liberal thing to do it. But if you have a choice, and this comes on to the political part of the book, choice has consequences. It isn't, some cases the consequences are good, in other cases they're less good. If you decide, if you look at America, one out of every four people changes their faith during their life. One out of it is close to 1 out of 2 if you treat different forms of, not the Protestantisms into different sorts. America is a place where people are changing their religion the whole time. They're choosing to do things. They're not necessarily just walking into the same church their parents did and starting from 6 and going all the way up to 70. If you start choosing, as an increasing number of people are around the world, what kind of religion you're going to do, you are, I would maintain, much less likely to leave that set of beliefs behind when you enter the ballot box, whether you go to the workplace, whether you go anywhere outside. It's becoming an act of choice rather than one of inheritance. And that, I think, does have big consequences. It's plainly good in some cases in terms of the effects of what religion can do. If you go to a town like Philadelphia, for instance, you see, actually, if you took away all the social services that religious people provide, you'd effectively have to find around $500 million a year more money from the state in order to provide things. One reason why religion has not done so well in Europe is partly because the state does do more things it does in America. I think the world where, Christopher Hitchens I think I would use in this respect as a fair example, the world where religion poisons everything, I think does not stand up to consequences. Certainly anyone who's wandered around the world and looked at all the horrors and good things that religion does, it's patently obvious that a huge amount of good work gets done which otherwise would not be done because of people who are religious. But there is also equally obviously bad consequences of what of the spread of religion. I think particularly this was the area that Europeans, unlike Americans, were right to be worried about. One reason why Europeans turned against religion is because they associated it with wars of religion. And I think there are two particular areas which stand out and which are likely, I think, to haunt politics for the future. The first is wars of religion, and the second are culture wars. What do I mean by wars of religion? I thought I would read out a speech by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to Iran's parliament quite recently. He asked, who are our enemies and why do they hate us? And his answer was that Iran faced an axis of evil, with its enemies being, I quote, all the wicked men of the world, whether abroad or at home. And the root cause of their hatred, he told the Iranians, was a loathing, the root cause of the opponents' hatred was a loathing of whomsoever should serve the glory of God. And he goes through all George Bush's atrocities, and then he tells the cheering MPs, truly your great enemy is the American, through that enmity that is in him against all that is of God in you. Fortunately, he said, Iran wouldn't fight alone. It had the support of Muslims around the world. Be bold, he advised, and you will find that you act for a very great many people that are God's own. Now, the interesting thing about that speech was it wasn't actually given by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, it was given by Oliver Cromwell in 1656. And he was reaching out to English Puritans rather than Iranian Muslims. And in that case, the great Satan was not George Bush, but Catholic Spain. That was the time of the 30 Years' War, a time, incidentally, when more people died in that conflict than they did in the Great Plague. I think now, if you're going to be worried about what religion could do to the world, I think there are similar worries to some extent. The most obvious one is if you have to look at the big conflicts that could rip apart our world, I think you could say 3 out of the 4 are actually got a very, very strong religious component. And those 4, I would say, were Israel, Palestine, India, Pakistan, America, Iran, and North Korea. Only North Korea, I think, strikes me as a totally secular one. If you look at terrorism, once again, we're living in a world which Cromwell, I think, would have found distinctly worrying and indeed familiar. One of the most interesting things to me is if you look at that videotape of Mohammed Siddiqui Khan talking about, prior to going off to go and bomb on 7/7, the parallels between that and Guy Fawkes back in 1604 are actually terrifying, even down to the fact they both speak in the same Yorkshire accent. One of them is the fact that, well, Micklethwait, we have to support Yorkshire, but it's the essence of a man who went overseas to get even more radicalised than he was when he left, and then came back with the aim of committing a huge act of terrorism. At the same time, other cynics would point out that the other problem we have, which is the same as Cromwell, is we have a great religion in schism or in crisis. We have the split between Sunni and Shia in Islam, and we have the ramifications of that, just as we had the ramifications of Christianity back in the 16th century. I would still say it's not remotely as bad as that, because we no longer have leaders who are pulling us towards this. It tends to be much more a bottom-up dispute. It tends to be much more an issue of people coming from down below, pushing things up, whereas back then you had a question of princes actually leading people into army under religious banners. But what is clear, and what is identical, is that once you get religion into a dispute, it is much, much harder to solve. If you want a perfect example of that, look at Israel-Palestine. You go back to the beginning of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, you have Israel set up by pretty secular Jews, particularly David Ben-Gurion, who gave the sort of religious lot something to hang on to, but basically the tone of the original Israel was very secular. The Palestine Liberation Organization for a long time was headed or led by Christians in fairly prominent positions. Now you have two sides who, at their most radical, both believe that God gave them a particular area of the world, and that makes compromise much, much more difficult. And the same, I think, applies to culture wars. Most places have managed to reach a sort of fuzzy compromise over issues like abortion, if you believe either that abortion is murder, or for that matter, on the other side, I suppose if you believe it is a fundamental right of every single person, it's much, much more difficult to compromise. And that brings me to the second sort of wars which I think are coming up, which are these culture wars. I think exactly the same thing that we saw in America is going to some extent come here. I don't necessarily mean abortion, but I do think technology is pushing us towards issues like stem cells, like cloning, which are going to have an effect in Europe. I think also we see the growth of Islam here is causing many of the same arguments that we thought had been dispatched 2 centuries ago to rearrange. What exactly is the role of particular services? Do people need different forms of justice systems? You have the issue of Sharia. You have the issue of whether the country can tell you what to wear through headscarves and so on. And again, I think what's interesting about this is it has crept up on us, because even in America, what is interesting is the politicians who have to deal with this, even bizarrely quite religious politicians themselves, never actually really saw this element of foreign policy coming up. Religion was the bit of foreign policy that everybody ignored, that nobody really saw. There's a wonderful Madeleine Albright anecdote about a Clinton cabinet meeting where one of them suddenly says, "Isn't it amazing? It's incredible, it's the end of the 20th century and we're still discussing a religious dispute in Northern Ireland." And the general assumption was this was the last possible version of this before finally that episode of diplomacy was thrown away. That was only 2 years before September 11th. I think what's interesting to me is that if you look at those two issues, one, the culture wars at home, secondly, these possible wars of religion between places, I think both to some extent lead back to America. They lead back to America because first, in terms of foreign policy, I think it is America which is the one which has to do most. I think fundamentally, you are never going to have a settlement of the sort of disputes which I mentioned earlier if you don't involve religious people in it. If you look at Northern Ireland, what's interesting was that they did actually bring priests and vicars into the discussion. What happened on British television, for those of you old enough to remember, was whenever any atrocity happened, you saw both a Catholic priest and a Protestant rector condemning the same atrocity, regardless of which side it was. Go to Jerusalem, you do not see that. You don't see when Israeli bombs fall on Palestinians, you don't see rabbis standing alongside mullahs to condemn it, and when suicide bombers coming the other way, you don't see the same thing in the other direction. Until that happens, I think people will find it very difficult to start to resolve these sort of debates. And it strikes me that again and again and again, people have not thought of the religious connotation within it. One of the great ironies of George Bush in Iraq was you had one of the most God-squadding presidencies ever, and yet they fundamentally sent people into Iraq without really understanding the difference between Sunnis and Shias. There is an element of diplomacy which repeatedly, and actually in some ways in America quite honourably, wants to push this to one side, but it is actually a cohesive and big part of modern politics, I think. In terms of the divisions at home, in terms of those culture wars, I think there actually America is much more useful as an example to us in Britain. I think the fundamental division between church and state in America is incredibly healthy, and it's something that we should have much firmer here. I think the US was right that what is good for religion in the sense of that split between church and state would also be good for here. I think the Church of England has nothing to gain, nothing to lose at all by trying to, by giving up the establishment cause. So it is, from my perspective, a sort of difficult world out there. I thought at the end, as I said, I would employ a second cheap trick, which I didn't do at the beginning. The second cheap trick is if you want to think about the world we're heading towards, my second cheap trick is to bring in Barack Obama, which is the other refuge of every politician in trouble at the moment, beyond saying they want to start a conversation. I think if you want to think about what sort of religion is the sort of religion which I think is going to spread pretty quickly, not as much in Europe as it does in America, but still with a potency here. I think when you think of American Christianity, you are much, much better thinking of Barack Obama than you are of George Bush. Because people, I think, when they had that idea of American religiosity, they tend to think of a man who had deep troubles with drink and then turned to a sort of vengeful, difficult, hard, executing version of Texan religion, and that was what motivated him. I think actually the Obama story, which is one of a clever, reasonably successful, young, whatever the word is, metropolitan, metrosexual person in Chicago who thought that his life was okay, but it lacking a certain something. It lacked a certain sort of meaning, and he found that in a Chicago church. That strikes me as a much more plausible, likely version of why religion might indeed grow again in Europe, because I don't believe to that extent that the suburbs of Doncaster or Paris are that different really to the same suburbs where Obama found that particular experience. Anyway, I've employed both my cheap tricks and talked for just over half an hour, which is longer than I said. So I will now open it up to questions. Thank you.
Why do you think that Europe and certainly like Britain, France, the Nordics are so much less religious than the rest of the world?
I do genuinely, I don't want to sound like a kind of free market fundamentalist, but I do think a lot of it had to do with that basic idea that there is an established church. There is one, if you sit and read Trollope, you just see a church which was obsessed by trying to climb up the different levels. If you were the vicar of Barchester, it didn't matter how many people you got in through the door. That wasn't even remotely part of your. All that mattered was you got on with the deacon of Barchester, and the same I think is true of quite a lot of the Catholic countries. It's obviously not just that, because you could argue there's been a more competitive market in most European countries since the beginning of this century. But I think by then, the sheer level to which religion had been taken out of many of the areas of kind of competitive society, I think that did make a difference. I mean, I think that's the main thing. It's not the only thing. You could argue that in general, the general culture of Europe is now so kind of completely unreligious that it's actually quite difficult for anything to take flower. But what's interesting is that actually there are bits. I mean, if you go to, in France, Pentecostalism is the fastest growing religion. I can't remember the exact statistics, but from a very small base, 1 million, actually more than that, I think it's almost 2 million Britons have been on the Alpha course, which makes me think, which is the one where you see, is there a meaning to life? And which seems, the Alpha course is sort of like a kind of purpose-driven life for English people, I suppose, a way of describing it. That seems to indicate to me something is going on. And if you're very optimistic from a religious point of view, you actually look at things like adult confirmations. So childish confirmations have gone down. Adult confirmations in the Church of England have gone up. And you can also look at odd things like pilgrimages. There's some. These are all straws in the wind. I don't expect. I would personally expect religion in Europe to go down a bit, but the same. What I describe as the Obama effect beginning to work. That people will start looking for bits of identity and meaning. The interesting thing to me is that we don't make any claim in this book that religion like that is going to come back in Europe immediately. What is interesting is over the past decade, I think religion has come back into European politics in a way that people utterly assumed it would go away. And the famous Blair quote about, "I don't do God," or not, it wasn't Blair, it was Campbell, but we don't do God on this side of the Atlantic. I think that's changed. Blair himself spends nothing else other than doing God at the moment. I think you have Brown, you have Sarkozy's written about religion. You see the introduction of some of the East European ones, admittedly the somewhat crazy Polish brothers being a good example, into European politics. And above all, actually, you see Islam. Islam. I don't buy any of those sort of Eurabia theories from the neocons, but the basic idea is Islam is posing questions, putting questions back into European politics, which people thought had gone. So for all those reasons, if you were to go and look at a set of articles about politics and religion 10 years ago, and you now look at them now, there's much more stuff going on. So religion coming back into Europe will take time. Religious politics is already there, I think. So that's one. Go on.
Hi. You mentioned the link between foreign policy and religion. You mentioned the link between foreign policy and religion, and China's increasingly becoming a confluence of religions, events from Xinjiang in the east all the way through to Burma and Nepal. How do you think this will shape China's foreign policy?
I went to a group at there's a sort of, I went to some American conservative meeting the other night in London where people seem to think this is a great hope for China. I think that would be going too far. What interests me, or rather the reason why it was on my mind is because there was a well-known American conservative sort of thinker who come across here. One of his arguments was that the more Christian, because the right wings of America have suddenly got onto this idea that Christianity is a big thing in China in a way that Europeans haven't, not least because they pour so much money in there. The theory he was adopting was that the more Christian they came, the less sort of bellicose China would get, which struck me as unlikely to the extent that when you talk to people like Wang, one of his reasons why he wants China to adopt Christianity or more Christian is so that China can be even stronger. He thinks that Christianity was key to America's success, so it would therefore make China ever more powerful. I think it must make a difference in the following sense, that if you suddenly have groups of Christians gathered around places, you've also got, it must make some difference to bits of the foreign policy. How much, I don't know. I still think foreign policy tends to be nowadays more driven by nationalism than it is by religion. But within China, it could make a big difference. I didn't talk about it, but I think China will certainly become the world's biggest Christian country really quite quickly. I think most people reckon it will also become the world's biggest Muslim country relatively quickly, because Islam is also doing quite well there. So that's another source of joyful conflict. Sorry, there's Peter and there's one here.
I had two questions. One was to elaborate on your statement about the wealthy or the educated, comprising a lot of religious people. Did you mean in terms of the percentage of people who are wealthy or educated versus poor and uneducated, or actually in numbers?
In terms of the stuff to do in terms of Turkey and India was just sort of anecdotal. If you look at the people, it's a bureaucratic bourgeoisie who are moving towards those papers. In America, my memory is it's both. Is if you look at the people who claim to be evangelicals, they tend to be better educated than the norm. If you take a certain norm for American education, more of them have college education, more of them have PhDs and all that type of stuff. I still think there is within America there is an element of. There is one way in which you can query that figure, which is I don't want to get too technical on it, which is basically I think some of the very conservative religious colleges aren't necessarily of the same caliber as the other ones. There's still, I think, actually, I think I'll be honest and say I've seen a tiny bit in the reception to this book amongst evangelicals. That basic American evangelicals are not always pleased by the degree of deliberative criticism is not always something which they terribly like.
Do you think it's the same in Islam?
Islam, I think the numbers are more questionable. Turkey, there's no doubt that exactly the people you talk to, all the army people and the secular heirs of Ataturk, they are horrified by the idea that exactly the people they wanted to be profoundly secular and to steer Turkey away from what Ataturk was very, very rude about all forms of religious clothing. Ataturk would have had a nightmare seeing the leader, one of his heirs standing welcoming Obama or whoever with his wife wearing a headscarf. All that stuff was exactly what they didn't want. I think in the rest of the Muslim world it's more generic. The numbers of the Muslim world is very difficult to tell. In Indonesia there's some evidence that there's a sort of clever young move back towards it. But it's more, Islam is much more difficult to get any kind of decent polling numbers because people are extremely reluctant to say they don't believe in God. And I should add that's true of pretty much all statistics to do with religion, so I've tried to take it in broad brushes rather than claiming particular bits.
Okay, and one last question was about corruption. Do you have any observations on corruption?
And religion? Well, I suppose, I do have one observation which is to do with foreign policies. I think I am personally always keen on particularly religious parties getting, I'm not saying I'm keen on religious parties getting into power, it could be misinterpreted, but an advantage of religious parties getting into power, and I think a lesson for the West is if you have a party like the AK party, let them get into power. They should have done the same in Algeria. Whenever you let a religious party come in, and you could argue this is probably true also things like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, it's true of arguably of Hamas in Palestine. If you let these people get power, they end up being more like other politicians than they certainly ever intended to be. They have to cut deals, they do things like corruption increase, and to some extent that special degree of moral superiority which religious parties can bring only when they're in opposition. I mean, at the moment, Egypt would be a classic example. You have the deeply corrupt and not altogether pleasant Mubarak regime. You have the Muslim Brotherhood, which has some pretty weird ideas, but basically if you go and meet them, they do evince a type of honesty and straightforwardness which you don't always get from the regime. At the moment the Egyptians won't in any way allow the Muslim Brotherhood to do anything. The Americans are paranoid about it because they sort of see senses of it's a cousin of Hezbollah and Hamas. Actually letting them into power, I think, the more power they have, the more people will begin to see how realistic it is. Ahmadinejad's another example of somebody who claimed to be a religious zealot but actually remains there because he stuffed ballot boxes. Sorry.
There is talk that the fiercer works of Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and everybody who think along those lines are actually doing the cause of secularism damage because it's driving people towards religion. I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
I think Dawkins is interesting. The only time I talk to Dawkins about it, Dawkins is so obsessed by the big scientific pictures that actually the idea that the sort of facts, I said to him, look, it's quite interesting, religion seems to be doing very well despite you. He didn't seem too obsessed by that. I think Hitchens probably more angry about it. And Sam Harris is, there is an element whereby what always tends to happen is once one side exaggerates its case, particularly American politics, the recent history of American politics has been of overreach by one side followed by the other. You have the 60s with a profound liberal, idiotic term for them, but you have a leftish overreach in the 60s, followed by 30, 40 years of conservatives, you could argue with Bush, you then have a pretty big overreach by the right, and then it's now balancing again. So I would expect something. So there's 3 there.
I have a question about your positive evaluation of the phenomenon and justifying it because people obviously have more choice. And I would just say a negative aspect of it is that not only there's a choice in what I spiritually choose to believe, but also it presents itself it creeps into the daily life by, for example, that creationism presents itself as a choice, an alternative to evolution. And I would argue thus that the sort of the tapestry of different religion that you have and that you can choose between them somehow also leads us to believe that there is that basically scientific facts are being disregarded for the sake of pluralism. Hence I would argue that I would sort of still argue in favor of modernity being understood as secularism in terms of that religion simply is often challenged by science and that scientific arguments are not being taken enough into account by religious people.
I think that's a choice you have to make. I think for my book, pluralism is the greater good out of those two. If you allow, there will be some, there'll be some elements of creationism. They tend to get pushed back. You could argue it's worse than you say, from some perspectives. You've got the anti-scientific lot. You've also got, as I said earlier, one interesting thing about a free market is it seems to encourage people with very strong brands. I mean, the Pentecostals are probably the least scientific out of all the Christian ones, and they're the ones who are doing best. So there is that risk, but I'm either the one religion I'm either such a fundamentalist on the market that I think that you have to open up. But then I think it's a fundamentally liberal thing to do. You give people the chance to understand how it works. For me, there's no better thing to lose faith in creationism than to visit, I think it's the Creation Museum in Kentucky, where very nice people try to explain to you why and they're extremely earnest and some of them even have rather strange doctorates, but they try to explain to you how, because they have to cram the whole of human history into 2,000 years, you literally go from Adam and Eve to they're in one exhibit, and then like so 53 years later, there are dinosaurs wandering around really quickly because they know those existed, and then suddenly we're into Abraham, and it's patently wrong, and I think anyone who goes to see it gets that quite quickly. And so just intellectually, I'm inherently on the kind of I feel lucky part of Google. Sorry, Peter. Yeah.
What do you think this might mean for technology and indeed Google? A lot of the phrases that you use, rational progress, modernity, apply to Google. Is there a danger of an emotional or religious backlash?
Google as a religion is interesting. I think there is. I think technology is part of the. What's interesting about these people? What's interesting about religious people is that, I mean, at one point we thought about putting this, but it became difficult to maintain. Is that you could argue that two of the earliest adopters of any technology tend to be firstly pornographers, and then actually churches are remarkably quick in terms of the way they grab new forms of technology and push it. Certainly amongst the American, if the American Christian thing is the general dynamic, those are about as pro-technology as it's possible to be. They're endlessly looking at new ways in order to get things through. They're very, very quick onto things like twittering and God knows what. All those things. So it's pretty technophile. Against that, you're right. There are some elements which are inherently suspicious of it, and there's an inherent. There is the bit where they get into trouble is more to do with biology than information technology, I think. It's quite interesting, actually, that in Africa, you can argue out of all the dominant religions there, and religions grow very quickly in Africa, the only religion that now accepts evolution, the only big one, is Catholicism, which is an interesting switch from where it was around the time of Galileo. Several, yeah.
I was just wondering, in all the different religious meetings that you've kind of visited through your research for the book, what was what was one experience that really affected you or kind of stayed with you?
I think there's two. I think the exorcism in Brazil was fairly was fairly, I can put it, a non-Brazilian was a fairly extraordinary experience. You went to, you go to a sort of normal middle class, kind of middle to working class suburb of São Paulo. You sit there in quite a large, one of those large churches which don't have much of an altar, and then you imagine you've got the wrong time because there's 3 exorcisms a week, and I think it was 3 o'clock on Wednesday. I compounded the error by we had a meeting of all the Latin American correspondents of the Economist in São Paulo that day, and it ended at lunchtime, and I foolishly said I was going off to an exorcism afterwards, and that sort of 2 of them and their girlfriends, so they want to come too, and you sort of arrive, and it's a bit like a sort of bad house party arrives in the middle of this church, and you sit there in this large place, and everyone's filing in, and then a huge number of housewives come in with their shopping, children. You get the general impression they just dropped off the laundry, they're picking up the children from school, and again everyone's just sort of sitting around quite normally, and then within the next, it barely takes an hour, they're reduced to these, quivering wrecks, where you see the same woman who just wandered in beside you with her children is sort of lying on the floor with people cursing spirits out of them. It's a very strong thing, exorcism in Brazil, because a lot of families who originally came from Africa, and to some extent believe that when they left Africa, old tribal religions cursed them for the fact that they were being shipped away as slaves to Brazil. And you see this thing where people are reduced to this strange shape, and then what happened, almost the strange thing to me was the children. The children sit there, play around in the back, watch their mothers descend to the floor in this kind of profound emotional state, and then when the guy brings them back out of it again, everyone picks up their shopping, picks up the children all go running around to gather around their mothers and then walk out again, and that extreme of emotion within an hour. And the odd thing was talking to the pastor who did it was almost like talking to a kind of surgeon after an operation. He said, well, today was quite good. There's 5 women I think we sold. It was very kind of, it was almost like he was sitting there smoking a cigarette saying, well, that was quite good. That wasn't, that was profound. I also thought that on the other side of it, as you go to a place like Nigeria, you actually see the religious war at its most intense. You see Christians funded by American collection plate money pushing northwards, and you see Islam founded by Saudi petrodollars coming southwards, and you just see this smashing together. And you can go to a place, and then a couple of weeks later, there's a fairly large-sized massacre. So those would be 2.
Hi. So you talked a lot about the rise of mainstream religion, and I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts on the phenomenon behind rising sect affiliation, like rising affiliation to sects.
Sorry.
Yeah.
To sects. Sorry, yes.
To sects, yeah. So namely Scientology, which has been huge uptake for the past few years, and I'm sure there are other quite big ones.
Well, the truth is, yeah, they are. Some of them are sects to the extent that they drag you in and they never really allow you out. And I'm glad to say we didn't really go into Scientology in perhaps the level it deserves, not least because they seem to be the most litigious group of religious people in the history of the world. I think what you really, what de Tocqueville said when he went to America was he said the reason why America does so well is the multiplicity of sects. This is because what happened at the time, Methodism seemed like a sect, and it's the ability, without trying desperately to drag you back to your homeland. It's the Silicon Valley aspect of American religion, which you see totally being mimicked in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America, actually, to a large extent, whereby people come and they set up, and you can see it a bit in London's East End as well. People have one set of, people join one church, and then they don't really like this bit, and so they start a new one. And if you want a figure who, to me, sort of symbolises that form of modern religion more than anyone else, it's Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson went through the Bible and cut out all the bits. I can't remember, he either cut out all the bits he did like or the bits he didn't, and threw the other bit away. And that was sort of his version of religion, where I'll take this. And that tends to be how most new sects develop. It's not the established religions have generally done quite badly. It's the newer ones which have kept pushing forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.